Saskatchewan. Start somewhere inside its borders, pick a direction, and you can drive for hours without ever leaving. A land as vast and varied as its rich history. It doesn't matter where you begin or where you end. It doesn't matter if you're moving or standing still. The place will come to you. It will whisper to you. It will tell you stories. It's a place full of stories. Stories of culture, stories of survival, stories of accomplishment, and stories of people. It will capture your imagination. It will become a part of you. It will move you. Beyond the pace of a life dictated by the whims of traffic lights lie the peaceful musings of grass blowing in the wind. A place, somewhere out there where the antelope roam and the combines play. It's a place, they say, where a life can be found, unlike any other the city lights may gaze upon. A rural life.
The name Everett Baker is synonymous with a body of photographs taken in the province from the 1940s through to the 1960s. His images provide a window on the social, natural, and historic development of Saskatchewan.
The subjects of these photographs knew Everett Baker or knew of him. I think that they're particularly relaxed in these photographs and often smiling at him in a kind of knowing way that is unusual in photographs at that time. We're used to photographs from the 1940s having a much more stilted quality. Everett Baker was American. He came from Minnesota. He was born in 1893 and he came to Saskatchewan in 1917 to sell books. He bought a farm south of Aneroid, Saskatchewan, and he farmed there.
In 1937, Baker took a position with the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool.
They decided to focus on rural development, on helping people live better lives in rural Saskatchewan. And in order to do that, they hired people called fieldmen. What he did as a fieldman was he would come to a small town, he'd set up a meeting. So he'd put up a notice on the door of the store or the church or the community center, and he'd invite people to come to a co-op organizing meeting. And he'd say to people at that meeting, okay, what's the problem in this place?
In the early 1940s, Baker became interested in photography, and he used his camera to capture images from his travels across the province.
So he started taking these slides so that he could illustrate his meetings with slides and examples of things going on in Saskatchewan. So the slides didn't only reflect just the co-op organizing, but also the history of the province of Saskatchewan.
Baker chronicled events from weather to the social gatherings he attended.
He would drive 1,500 miles in a month, and he had his camera, of course, with him. And I imagine that as he came across any sort of weather phenomena like great clouds or lightning or a storm approaching, he would take photographs of that. So that's a kind of continuing theme through his work, really, is kind of 20 years of documenting incredible weather. And there's some other funny photographs, like there's one photograph of a man standing holding hailstones, these huge hailstones. The look on the guy's face is just like, can you believe I'm a farmer in a place where these come down out of the sky? It's kind of hilarious and horrible at the same time.
In 1957, after retiring from the wheat pool, Baker became president of the Saskatchewan History and Folklore Society.
There have been so many changes, even in Everett Baker's time in Saskatchewan from 1917 to 1957, but he could see that there was kind of a disappearing body of knowledge, the people that were passing away that had first come to Saskatchewan, and also First Nations people who could remember prior to all the settlers coming here. So Everett Baker was really involved in trying to record that history.
Shortly before his death, Baker donated his collection of 11,000 slides. They eventually came into the possession of the Saskatchewan History and Folklore Society. Baker's photographs provide a personal glimpse into the people and places of the province he loved.
People look so relaxed because they were relaxed with this person who was a lovely man who, was a great public speaker and had great stories and devoted his life really to making rural Saskatchewan a better place to live.
For over 50 years, Saskatchewan has been home to a distinct religious group commonly referred to as the Hudderites.
The Hutterian Brethren, as they're more properly called, are part of this Anabaptist tradition that emerges out of the Protestant Reformation in Europe.
Hutterite beliefs prohibited allegiance to any state or government. For this reason, they were often persecuted.
They were certainly persecuted by the Russian government, and in 1870, most of the Hudderites who were then living in the Ukraine migrated to the United States, to Dakota Territory actually.
The Hudderites lived peacefully in the U.S. until the First World War. As pacifists, the Hudderites refused to participate in military service, and they once again faced discrimination.
Well, we believe in the Ten Commandments. The dear Lord read that with his own hands. You shall not kill.
In 1918, most of the U.S. Hudderites migrated to Alberta and Manitoba, where they were welcomed for their agricultural expertise. The Hudderites living in Alberta prospered and rapidly expanded their land holdings. But as the colonies prospered, locals became jealous.
This resulted in the enactment of a piece of legislation called the Land Sales Prohibition Act in 1942, which outright prohibited all land sales to Hudderites in Alberta. After the war, that legislation was repealed and replaced by another bill called the Communal Property Act, which attempted to control the expansion of Hutterite colonies and to limit the size of those colonies.
As a result, many Hudderites migrated again, this time to Saskatchewan.
The first Hutterite colonies were established in southwestern Saskatchewan near Maple Creek and Shaunavon in 1953. Today there are about 50 Hutterite colonies in Saskatchewan with an average population of about 100 on each colony.
One characteristic of a Hutterite community is the joint sharing of wealth. Despite persecution, Hutterite life remains much like it did 400 years ago.
They continue to follow their traditional way of life, to wear a very simple and traditional dress. They are pacifists. They still speak the same Low German that they spoke in the 1530s, and they are very successful farmers.
The amusings of small-town life come with a charm woven between the smiles of those who live there. They are the creations of real imaginations. The bizarre and the commonplace all found in the same watering hole. They are the beyond urban realizations of those who came with an idea and a broom.
In the mid-1980s, the residents of Lumsden faced a big problem.
We found out that our rink was more or less condemned. So what we ended up doing is, very quickly, as any community does, you get together, what are we going to do?
Several local residents geared up to find a way to build a new rink. Ken Wade, former ticket manager of the Saskatchewan Roughriders, provided a novel fundraising idea.
One day he comes and he says, listen, this is what you should do. There's a duck race that they run in Calgary. Maybe you should look at that.
But for the idea to hold water, some bends in the river needed to be navigated.
For instance, where do you get ducks? I ended up buying them through Federated Cooperative, and they came from Taiwan. Had to buy $21,000 minimum, had to pay for these things up front, and you haven't even sold a ticket.
So with more than 20,000 plastic ducks and a debt of $7,000, the Lumsden Duck Derby was officially launched. Unfortunately, the Duck Derby drew more questions than ticket sales.
We were in a mall in Regina in June, thinking that everybody would buy tickets. The first day we sold 2, because nobody understood what we were doing. I even had phone calls from people thinking that we were using live ducks. I had an environmental person phone me thinking that we were going to pollute the river. We had all sorts of interesting things.
Undeterred by their slow start, the Lumsden crew refused to give up. Their perseverance eventually paid off.
Believe me, the start of August, we were worried sick. We thought we had a dud, and by Labor Day, well, we just couldn't believe how well it went. It just exploded. The park was packed. We had the population of this town tripled.
As the Duck Derby grew in popularity, so did the number of events associated with it.
We start off the morning with pancake breakfast at the Centennial Hall here in Lumsden. We have some face painting and petting zoo, and that leads up into the parade the post, and then after the parade, we drop the ducks into the river.
Despite thousands of little plastic ducks, the people of Lumsden remain at the heart of the Duck Derby.
There's hundreds of people that get involved every year with it. Everyone's selling tickets and they work in the malls selling tickets, and if it wasn't for the volunteers, we wouldn't be as successful.
4 years after the Derby's inception, the people of Lumsden were rewarded with the fruits of their labor.
We put the rink up, and it was a real gamble because once you put the thing up, then you're concerned that are we going to keep selling tickets year after year?
10 years after the first plastic ducks raced downriver, the Lumsden Sports Centre was paid off. To this day, the Lumsden Duck Derby stands as one of Saskatchewan's most innovative fundraising events. It also stands as one of the most plastic fundraising events.
Curling's been declared Saskatchewan sport above hockey.
Historical evidence suggests people curled as early as the 16th century. By the 18th century, curling had become widespread in Scotland, and immigrants to Saskatchewan brought the game with them.
They started on the outdoor ponds near Prince Albert, throwing tamarack rocks.
As the sport gained in popularity, small clubs formed throughout the province. Saskatchewan adopted the game with a passion and soon had 538 curling clubs, more than all the rest of Canada. The first clubs featured outdoor ice covered by thatched wooden huts to protect the curlers from the snow and wind. And by 1900, the sport was mostly played indoors. One reason the sport may have attracted such a large audience was the wide age range it catered to. The most famous team to come out of Saskatchewan was the Schmerler Rink. The team claimed 3 Canadian championships and an unprecedented 3 World's Championships before winning the gold medal at the 1998 Olympics in Nagano.
They were just diplomats, very, very competitive, focused, great bunch of girls, and just excellent at curling.
As long as Saskatchewan has been a province, curling has been its sport. And based on the sport's consistent popularity, it always will be.
Beyond Urban, a place can be found where a loon calls out the daily box scores and then files them under W for who cares. You can get lost in this place. You can make a life in this place. And if you're unfortunate enough, you might find an unforgettable adventure on your way in.
We went right through that thunderstorm. There was lightning, there was everything all around us, heavy rain, and we were right in the middle of it, and we had this twin otter floats. And I'm sure if you could have been on the outside looking in, all you'd have seen is 6 great big eyeballs looking out. We finally had to land. It got pretty violent.
Mentioning the words bush pilot probably conjures images of dangerous solo flights across the sometimes desolate but always beautiful North Country.
I started flying and I went up to L'Orange and I couldn't believe the Canadian Shield and how beautiful it was up there. Never heard of Uranium City, never heard of Wollaston Lake, nothing. Quite an experience, I'll tell you. Seeing all this stuff, learning about a whole new province of Saskatchewan.
Bush flying started just after World War I, when pilots returned home and decided to turn their flight training into work. Some became barnstormers, offering rides as entertainment, while others saw a need that could become a business. At the time, roads didn't stretch very far north, but distant northern communities and industries still needed regular supplies and mail. Bush pilots in planes equipped with floats for summer and skis for the winter still service those communities along with the industries associated with them. By helping with medical emergencies, bush pilots have been the lifeline to northern communities. Bush pilots have always required a certain amount of bravery, flying to distant locations, practically charting their way as they fly. Some of that courageous spirit still exists in modern-day bush pilots who can't seem to resist a challenge. As roads push farther and farther north, the need for bush pilots seems to be diminishing.
So I think the life of the bush pilot is slowly fading, slowly disappearing with the advent of wheeled airplanes.
Although bush pilots might one day become a part of history, remote communities will always have a debt to pay to the courageous pilots who boldly went where only a few dared to go.
Every fall it's nice to get out and be working outside. I think most of the people that work with me too, they are doing it because they like being outside. It's just like paid hard work and holiday.
First Nations people have farmed wild rice for hundreds of years, but it wasn't until the 1930s that it was grown in Saskatchewan.
The federal government had planted some in this area for muskrat habitat, and then in the late 70s it got some interest in harvesting. There had been some down in Manitoba.
In the 1980s, entrepreneurs saw a market for wild rice, and soon companies such as Reese's Canadian Lake Wild Rice sprang up.
I started in 1981. We started pretty small. By 1982 we had some small lakes that we'd taken and seeded rice, and then we took the seed from that and kept expanding it until we got quite a sizable operation.
Wild rice is grown and harvested in lakes and rivers, which means that rice farmers do not own the property they farm.
It works similar to a community pasture. We actually lease it from the government. We lease the bays that we're in and the areas of the lake, the rivers. And we pay them an annual lease fee for using it.
Wild rice is a reseeding plant, so for farmers with established riced areas, the main duties in the spring and summer are simply monitoring the plants. The real work begins when farmers practice their special method of bringing in the crop.
We have 20-foot scoops on the airboats, and we use sort of an Everglade airboat. So you literally hit it with this speedhead we call the front of the scoop, and it falls back in the screen and then down onto a tray. And as we're going along and fill the tray, we come to our bagging boats and lift it up and dump it in the bagging boats, and the fellas bag it, put in bags in about 55, 60-pound bags.
The rice seeds don't all mature at the same time, so multiple harvests of the same plant are required.
It's about 6 to 7 days between picks, and we'll be out here for about 6 weeks. By the time we get everything harvested, 6 or 7 weeks. Usually we start in August and go the first week in October.
Saskatchewan farmers bring in over 2 million pounds of rice per year. This makes Saskatchewan one of Canada's leading wild rice producers. Wild rice farming is a multi-million-dollar industry in northern Saskatchewan. It employs over 200 people every year and makes a strong impact on the province's economic growth. The Saskatchewan forestry industry began in 1872, when the Dominion Lands Act created commercial forest zones. As the industry started out, all lumber was sawed into boards by hand. But in 1877, the first of many technological advances arrived.
The first real powered sawmill in Saskatchewan was built by a Captain Moore, and he bought steam power equipment for a steam-powered sawmill. They installed it on some Hudson Bay property on the east side of the Prince Albert settlement.
Timber felled in Sturgeon and Anglin lakes was sent to Prince Albert via the Little Red and the North Saskatchewan rivers.
River driving is one of the most economical means of delivering wood. The wood was dumped on the ice during the winter, and when it melted, then they would open the dam up and flush the wood down the stream.
The arrival of the railway in Prince Albert in 1890 provided the industry with another necessary boost.
With better transportation, a lot more sawmill equipment came in and other sawmills were built.
By the turn of the century, 4 sawmills operated at Big River, Crooked River, Prairie River, and Prince Albert. As sawmill capacity increased, timber needed to move more effectively. Horses were replaced by a more modern form of transportation.
After 1907, they had these steam-powered locomotives with crawler tracks on them. This machine was called the centipede, and there were numerous of these everywhere. They would draw a water tank along behind them, and they would ice the roads. And then they could make a sleigh train behind and pull, like a train locomotive pulling a train of railway cars.
By 1911, the largest sawmill in the British Commonwealth operated in Big River, producing 1 million board feet of lumber every day.
During the First World War, or the start of it, the sawmills here in Prince Albert were producing as much white spruce lumber as the whole of BC was producing.
From 1945 to 1946, the industry produced more than 140 million board feet of lumber, 304,000 railway ties, and more than 80,000 telephone poles. Technology continues to make the forestry industry more efficient in all aspects of production, from harvesting to processing.
Now, the modern mills today have computers that scan every log. The computer automatically cuts the log into the highest value lumber that you can use.
Environmental concerns are at the forefront of the industry. The world's first closed-loop, effluent-free pulp mill is located in Meadow Lake. The industry plants more than 16 million seedlings each year. The future of the industry looks bright, with 35.5 million hectares of forest land, which is more than half the total area of the province. Nearly 8,000 people work in the forest industry, which produces more than 400 million board feet of lumber.
As long as the forests are regenerated, the future is there forever.
Upon the horsehair and board, they make stomping sounds with their feet. They make happy sounds with their eyes, and they make beyond urban realizations that they have arrived in a place where the rhyme in the song can stay up all night long.
The people of Saskatchewan have long been known for their willingness to cut a rug, to spend an evening dancing up a storm. Perhaps our penchant for dancing can be traced to Manitou Lake, where dance halls flourished, especially from the 1920s to the 1940s. Cars were lined up as far as the eye could see, and excursion trains traveling from Winnipeg to Edmonton stopped there.
There was no admission charged at the doors. It used to be you could walk into any of these halls, take a seat, and watch and listen. If you wanted to dance, you had to pay 10 cents a dance, and they had big crowds in those days.
One of the most renowned halls was Danceland, built in 1928. Nearly 80 years later, it remains popular, in part due to its unique 5,000 square foot dance floor.
The two top floors are all floating on the horsetail hair. It allows the floor to go down about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. The floor will bounce, and it's so much easier on your legs and feet.
It isn't just the floor, but the structure of Danceland that creates a dynamic musical experience.
The acoustics are so great that I've had some very good entertainers tell me they compare it to Carnegie Hall in New York City for acoustics. And there are reasons for it. It's the open trusses, it's a wooden facility, and most of my bands here can turn their volume way down. They don't have to turn it up loud in here. Everybody can hear the music great.
In the 1980s, Danceland was renovated, allowing the facility to operate through all 4 seasons.
We have 4 big furnaces heating the facility. We can have dances all year round now.
Over the years, Danceland's reputation has grown throughout Saskatchewan and beyond.
The lines on the highway can tell you. The blowing wind will let you know. The place behind the dark where a stranger can see is simply beyond urban. Those silhouettes, those giants hanging out by the tracks, they're the ones who made the place becoming. They're the ones we remember when the talking's all done and the times are all had.
The Saskatchewan Wheat Pool opened its first elevator, aptly named Pool Elevator No. 1, on July 1st, 1925 in Bullier, Saskatchewan. By 1930, the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool had built or acquired nearly 1,000 elevators. Eventually, over 3,200 elevators were built. These first elevators were built by farmers and local businessmen and varied in size and style. In the 1920s, elevator construction companies were established. Crews traveled from town to town, building elevators, and as a result, a more uniform design evolved. Grain elevators are the most recognizable landmarks of the prairie. They are the markers on the horizon. The identity of many rural communities was inextricably tied to these sentinels of the prairie. A 2 or 3 elevator community meant a settlement of about 100 people. A 5 or 6 elevator town signified a restaurant and a bank. The significance of these structures to the identity of the province became apparent in 1939, when King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visited Canada. While touring the country, the monarchs planned a 10-minute stop in Melville. To honor their visit, the locals painted a welcome message on the most conspicuous landmark, the grain elevator. Towards the end of the century, concrete inland terminals began to replace wooden grain elevators. By 1999, there were only 304 elevators remaining, the oldest one being the Fleming Tower, built in 1895. Despite their dwindling numbers, grain elevators are still celebrated throughout the province. They are seen in our art and literature as a symbol of our relationship with the land and our ties to each other.
There's a life in Saskatchewan that's beyond urban. There's a place in the province that's nowhere else. It's the place we came from to get to here. It's the vast distance we cover with odometer readings stretched beyond their measure. In Saskatchewan, there's a place that's in the middle of everywhere. A place where you can find the heart of a people bound by distance.